Well, we've been talking about the situation in the new republic after independence was secured with the victory over the British. And now we're going to take a brief look at economics, because there's going to be two very different views on trade and on the economy. And a lot of this was influenced by this guy, Adam Smith, who was not American, didn't live in the United States. He was British, actually Scottish by birth, and he was an economist who in 1776, the same year that the revolution, independence was declared, wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. That was an extremely, extremely influential book and still is. In fact, if you are not familiar with Adam Smith, depending on your major, you probably will be more familiar with him by the time you're finished with college. So, just kind of a quick overview of the Wealth of Nations and Adam Smith's ideas. He was against mercantilism. Mercantilism was the economic practice of not only Great Britain, but all the colonial powers in the 18th century and in the previous couple of centuries, that essentially mercantilism meant that the government controlled foreign trade in order to maintain a balance of trade. So we've kind of talked about this already, the fact that Great Britain essentially had a lot of laws and a lot of rules about who British subjects could trade with. That if there was an opportunity to get something cheaper from a non-English supplier, frequently that was against the law. So Smith was against that. He was arguing the opposite. He was arguing for what today would be called free trade. And he talked about something that he called the invisible hand of the market, which was the idea that the government doesn't need to have excessive regulations on trade, that if you leave business relatively alone, it will regulate itself based on the dictates of the market. Market realities will cause shifts and result in balance. In this way of thinking, by the way, that's called a laissez-faire approach, which was not coined by Adam Smith, but rather by a French guy. And that's how you pronounce it, by the way, en français, laissez-faire, not laissez or lazy-faire, like my high school teacher used to pronounce it. Laissez means to allow, and faire means to make or do. So let it do. Let it go. Just keep your hands off, essentially. Let it be. That's what that means. Also, Smith's concepts included the idea that people acting in their own self-interests, thinking primarily of themselves and their profit, is good in the long run for society, because the more people are acting in their own self-interest, the more they will kind of cancel each other out and keep anyone from being in complete control or having what would be referred to later as a monopoly. All right, so very influential idea. The other approach, though, well, mercantilism, had been basically the go-to for basically all European powers, and they're going to shift away from that in the late 18th and into the 19th century as the Industrial Revolution starts. But in the new United States, there was conflict in how this idea was viewed. Some of the quote-unquote founding fathers, some of the framers of the Constitution, were very influenced by Smith, others were not. Now, some people believed in the new American government that wages and prices had to be controlled by the government for the public welfare, that if business was allowed to run rampant, they would trample over the natural rights of the citizens unless the government gave them guidelines to operate within, sometimes strict guidelines. So this idea basically said that the community good is more important than the individual good, that the individual can damage the community, whereas Adam Smith's approach was that the individual good leads to the community good. So a lot of people believed that. Then other people were in the government, in this new government, in favor of free trade, or as Thomas Jefferson put it, trade that should be as, quote, free as air. In Pennsylvania in particular, there was a lot of support among the citizenry for the idea of wage and price controls and limiting, at least in some degree, businesses, because there was a feeling among a lot of people in Pennsylvania that a lot of folks in Pennsylvania had gotten quite rich from the war, from selling munitions or from raising their prices at a time when the citizens were not able to come up with what they needed to buy the stuff that was required for them. And I'm going to go ahead and bring this in now. Remember earlier I talked about the fact that Pennsylvania's state constitution in 1776 established a unicameral legislature, no upper house, just one house. And they also they removed all property requirements to vote. So all white males 21 years of age and older could vote. Part of the reason that Pennsylvania had the most radical shift in that direction was that in Pennsylvania, many of the wealthier people, when Pennsylvania was a colony, as the Revolution was gearing up, many of the wealthier people in Pennsylvania were loyal to the king. They were Loyalists or Tories, and many of them left after the war, and certainly they weren't regarded fondly by their neighbors if they stayed, so their voice was removed in a lot of the voting and stuff, and more of the craftsmen, middling class, working class people, their vote counted for more. And in some of the neighboring states, they wouldn't have even had a vote. So anyway, that sounds like, a good segue into talking about Loyalists. But first, I just want to point out these conflicting views: free trade, government regulation, the benefit to the individual versus the benefit to the community. Those arguments are going to lead, within a few years, to the first political parties. And those arguments, if you turn on the news, if you follow what's going on, those arguments are still being had today by the two major parties. So that's not something new. It started at the very beginning. I think in some ways it's kind of the essence of what America is, at least from one perspective. It is a tension between the individual and the community, and in how America looks at itself, and in how laws get passed and what laws get passed, continues to reflect that tension and that balance. Anyway, Loyalists, let's talk about them for a while. Here is a nice map that shows in purple the United States during the Revolution. The red spots are areas where there were a lot of people loyal to the king, a lot of Loyalists. So if you look at this, there's little spots all over, quite a few spots outside the United States, not surprisingly. But within the U.S., you'll notice that there around New Jersey, Pennsylvania border, there's a lot. And North Carolina There's especially a large number, and quite a few in South Carolina. Well, in all, it is estimated that anywhere between 20 to 25%, maybe as many as 1/3 of Americans didn't want to be Americans. They considered themselves British subjects after the Revolution started and remained loyal to the British Crown. So called Loyalists, also called Tories, which comes from British political parties. The terms Tory and Whig we inherited from the British political system. Out of that large number, 20,000 of them joined the British Army and fought, in some cases, against their neighbors during the Revolution, making the Revolution kind of a civil war as well as a rebellion. As well as a rebellion against an occupying power. Anyway, after the war ended, more than 100,000 of these loyalists left the country. Did not want to live in this newly established country out from under the British Crown. So a lot of them went to Canada. Some of them went to England. Quite a few of them actually went to British colonies in the Caribbean. And here I have Joseph Galloway as a good example of this. Joseph Galloway was a very prominent colonist in Pennsylvania, very active in Pennsylvania politics, a very close friend and ally of Benjamin Franklin. And when that first Continental Congress had been called to figure out how to respond to these things that Britain was doing, he was a delegate from Pennsylvania along with Benjamin Franklin to that body. However, as votes were taken and as it became increasingly clear that the colonies were moving toward declaring independence, something he voted against, he left and he moved to England. I think in 1778, maybe it was after the war had started. He moved to England to be an advisor to the British government, and when the war was over, just stayed there. All right. Spoiler alert, there will be a constitution coming up, and we'll be talking a lot about that. But you probably already know there is one, and that it starts with the words, "We the people of the United States of America." So what I'm doing now is trying to take a look at who we the people are. So we've already looked at some conflicting views about which way to go economically. So that tells us a little bit about class. And we've looked at those Americans who hadn't intended on becoming Americans. A lot of them left, but many of them stayed. Many of them stayed and didn't face a whole lot of reprisal or anything like that, and made their way in what was now their new country. What we're going to do now is kind of take a look around this new country at various different groups and see where they are as the new country is beginning. So we're going to begin with American Indians, and then we're going to look at African Americans, and we're going to look at women and various other things. But to begin with, talking about the Native American situation at the end of the Revolution. Well, during the Revolution itself, Indians had been divided. Most of the tribes had sided with the British, but some had sided with the United States. In fact, the very first Indian treaty made by the United States of America was made in 1776 with the Delaware tribe to be allies against the British. But the majority sided with the British because that seemed to be where their bread was most buttered, so far as who had the most respect for their rights. Remember the proclamation line of 1763 that the British government had laid down. that prevented or forbade, it didn't actually literally prevent, as it turned out, colonists from going into Indian country. Whereas the colonists, and now the Americans, wanted that country. Anyway, all that is now irrelevant because Britain lost. Britain lost, and once again, just like at the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, there had been a treaty negotiation held at Paris, and it happens again in 1783 in Paris to set the peace conditions between the British and the Americans. And just like 20 years before, there weren't any Indians invited to this party that was going to decide their fate and the fate of their land. The U.S. government now took control of the Ohio Valley, finally, that they had been that the colonists had wanted for so long, and they told the Indians there, because you sided with the British against us, you forfeited the right to your lands. And that was despite the fact that some of the Indians there had not sided with the British, but had sided with the U.S. This is not going to be taken lightly. There will be more conflict. But really, the American Revolution was extraordinarily important for American Indians. It was one of the most important events in Native American Indian history because it was a turning point, you see. Maybe I should say 1783 and the treaty was a turning point because before that, various native tribes were dealing with multiple colonial powers from Europe. For the longest time, it was England, France, and Spain. And that gave the Indian tribes some leverage. It gave them some political ability because if one of those powers wasn't offering you a deal that you liked, you could say, for example, to England, well, unless you give us a better deal or unless you respect our tribal sovereignty more, we will instead trade with your enemies, the French or the Spanish, or we will ally with them. So if you want us on your side, and then they could say the same thing to the others, and that gave them some traction. That gave them really an ability to bid on their own existence and their own futures. Then when the French were kicked out of North America by the British and the Spanish east of the Mississippi essentially were only in control of Florida, that put them in a bad spot. But now the British have been kicked out, and all that remains is this new government, the United States of America, one monolithic governmental power that you can't play off against anybody else. So that is a disadvantage. Another disadvantage is the fact, remember that proclamation line of 1763, the fact that the new country, the political leaders, are right there in North America. Okay, so when it was English colonies, the final decisions were made in London by Parliament, influenced by the King. And they were taking, as I've stressed several times, they tended to take a global view because they had to look after all their interests all around the world. So they were a lot less likely to want to come in and just eradicate Indians and take away all their land. And they didn't want their colonists doing that either because it would lead to costly wars they didn't want to have to pay for. But now the British are gone. And now all the political decisions are being made by politicians who are American, who represent constituents in the areas bordering Indian lands, constituents or voters who want Indian lands and who, if they don't get what they want from their politicians, won't vote for them anymore. You see where I'm going with this? The new government, the American government, is much, much more highly motivated, if they want to stay in office, to do what the citizens want where Indians are concerned. And what the citizens want is Indians gone so as to have their land. Thomas Jefferson was the first to propose the idea publicly that all the Indians east of the Mississippi would ultimately have to be removed and sent somewhere else, west of the Mississippi, which the Mississippi was the U.S. border at that time. Now Jefferson he had some positive views toward Native Americans, and he actually he believed that they would be killed by their white neighbors in order to take their land, unless they were moved somewhere else. Now they didn't want to move somewhere else. We'll get into all that later. But this is when that idea started being tossed around. Let's just send them out of the country. But there was a problem, because if you go across the Mississippi, you're in Spanish territory at this time, and you can't just dump a bunch of people into another country's territory and property. Well, as all this is happening, the Indians have realized that they cannot win, most of them, not all of them, but most have realized they cannot win militarily, and they have begun to organize politically. They have, in fact, kind of co-opted the language of the Revolution. All those things the colonists were saying about natural rights, about life, liberty, and property, and the pursuit of happiness. Many Indians in their negotiations, many chiefs in their diplomatic meetings started saying those things too. That they're human beings and have rights, and that liberty should count across the board. Well, I'm guessing you probably know how that story ultimately turns out. It was not a happy story, because that idea of securing liberty and all men being created equal didn't seem to apply to all men, after all, from the point of view of the Americans, at least white Americans. Now let's look at African Americans at the end of the American Revolution. So what happens in a new country that is framed on the ideals of liberty and equality, but which practices slavery? This has been referred to as the Great American Paradox: liberty and slavery existing and being extolled side by side in the early years of the Republic. Now, on the one hand, that seems to fly in the face of everything that the patriots, had been saying about liberty and equality. On the other hand, though, one could make the argument that it did fit in with John Locke's philosophies, as long as you don't consider the people of African descent as being equal citizens and having rights, that is. But the idea of life, liberty, and property, remember that? That's one of the foundational elements of this classical liberalism that had become so incredibly popular. Protection of property. Well, Southerners would say at that point, Southern members now of the Southern states, we have to protect our property. Arguments were also made to the effect that liberty was impossible to sustain without slavery. And we'll talk in more detail about some of those really wacky arguments, because it doesn't hold up. But essentially, this argument says that, and by the way, this argument was made by wealthy plantation owners, among others, that having slavery means there's someone to do the manual labor, and then men of wealth don't have to do that, don't have to worry about it, and so they have free time to engage in community service and do good things for the greater good for the community and be politicians and stuff. Again, well, I always think of the quote by Abraham Lincoln, and I am just slightly paraphrasing it, when he said, whenever someone praises to me the virtues of slavery, I have a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally, to see how he'd feel then. Other people felt differently. Particularly, in the northern states, there was starting to be a lot more of an opposition to slavery, even at this early point. And in Britain, and we kind of talked about this earlier, the hypocrisy that was viewed in this new United States of America, for all of its lofty speech about liberty, freedom, and equality, to have slavery. Edmund Burke, famous British politician at the time, said that it was the fact that they owned slaves that made colonists so sensitive about freedom to begin with, because they got to see what it was like not to have it. And that makes some degree of sense if you're talking about southern states and you think about like the regulators in the Carolinas. Although there were people in the North who were also saying that the way they were being treated by the British was akin to slavery. But my favorite quote from a British person on this subject is by Samuel Johnson, who said, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes?" Well, I said that there was some feeling of opposition in the northern states. Now, Quakers had by and large opposed slavery for a long time, from early on, although not all Quakers did. And a handful of other individuals before the Revolution had voiced opposition to slavery, but not large numbers. By the time the Revolution came along, most thinkers, most Enlightenment thinkers, believed that, and this includes the Founding Fathers. In fact, I looked up, I Googled which Founding Fathers opposed slavery, and it listed all of them, which isn't really true. The general feeling was slavery was an evil thing. Slavery was wicked. Slavery was a curse that the British had cast upon the colonies. That's how Thomas Jefferson tried to present it in the Declaration of Independence, but he was forced to take that part out. And everyone believed, generally speaking, that slavery was going to fade away. It had already largely faded away in the North. There were still some slaves in the North, and slavery was still legal in the North, in the northern states, even when they were established. But there weren't as many as there previously had been. And the feeling was that's going to happen in the South, too. Some quotes from Northerners who were part of that founding revolutionary generation. James Otis of Massachusetts said, "What man is or ever was born free if every man is not?" And from Philadelphia, Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the forgotten founders. He's not on any coins or anything, but he was an important person in his time. He called slavery a national crime. But remember what I said about the general belief that slavery was evil, slavery was wrong, and Britain had stuck us with it, and it's going to be too hard to get rid of, so you should just let it gradually fade away. That's what Southern plantation owners said at the time. So you can find quotes from Thomas Jefferson, from George Washington, from James Madison, and various other Southern politicians who will say slavery is evil. But they all had slaves, and they didn't set them free. The feeling was, like I said, gradually going to fade away over time. There was this fear that if it were ended too suddenly, it would be too disruptive. It would cause chaos. It would lead to race riots and other things. That was the argument. Thomas Jefferson described it this way. He said that having slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears. in the sense that it's dangerous to hold a wolf by the ears. But once you're holding a wolf by the ears, it's also dangerous to let go. So he was saying that this is something that we're stuck with, and we can't just end it overnight. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the Compromise of 1820, which is when that quote by Jefferson was made. However, there were still many people in the northern states opposed to slavery and wanted to actually see it end, either gradually or in some cases more quickly. Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay of New York, John Adams, all were against slavery. George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson sounded like they were against slavery. But that's an important distinction. They sounded like it, but they still had slaves. So don't lose sight of that fact. And don't lose sight that this is the common thinking in the late 1700s. And we're going to look at ways in which that thinking begins to change. Now, I mentioned that there had been some earlier opposition to slavery, and this goes way back to the beginning of that century with a pamphlet, a short book really, called The Selling of Joseph by Samuel Sewall, published in 1700, the first abolitionist publication in what would become the United States, in the English colonies. Samuel Sewall was a Puritan, and not only was he a Puritan, he was really Puritan. He was one of the judges in the Salem witch trials. So, you can't completely, say that his judgment was blameless and everything. But in this regard, he was ahead of his time in condemning slavery. And the selling of Joseph, if you are familiar with the book of Genesis and the story of Joseph and his coat and his brothers, how his jealous brothers sold him into slavery because they didn't like him. And it came back upon them in the sense that God elevated Joseph up, and all of them were subdued below Joseph in the end. Well, the Revolution made it a lot harder to defend slavery for the very reasons that I have mentioned, right? When everyone's talking about liberty and equality and all men being created equal, except those that look a certain way, and they're destined to forced servitude. That doesn't really ring honest and authentic. And this is why that in the northern states in particular, there started to be more resistance to slavery. Kind of the same way that indentured servitude just didn't sound that good anymore when you're establishing a country based on freedom. Well, during the war itself, in various New England states, slaves petitioned for their freedom, and we'll talk about a couple of those in just a few minutes. Also, I think it's an interesting thing to point out that during the war, South Carolina, I believe it was South Carolina and also Georgia, refused to allow black soldiers to enlist in their militias to fight against the British. But over the course of the war, near the end, remember a lot of the fighting took place in South Carolina. I remember also that the French joined in. The French sent troops to help the Patriots against the British. Some of those troops came from Saint-Domingue, which would later be known as Haiti. So black French troops were coming to help save South Carolina, even though South Carolina wouldn't allow black troops to serve in their army. Remember also, though, from our earlier discussion, that there were far more African Americans who joined the British Army than who joined the Continental Army or the American militias, particularly after that offer by Lord Dunmore of Virginia to free any slave of a rebellious master who joined the British Army. When the war was over, and that treaty negotiation was going on in Paris in 1783, one of the conditions that the United States had was that the British Army return all those runaway slaves. And to their credit, the British government refused to do so. They refused to basically sell out, literally, you might say, to betray those black soldiers who had fought in crimson on their side. And so that was the sticking point. Didn't happen. They wouldn't do it. And many of those African American loyalists were in fact repatriated by the British to Canada. Now, General George Washington, was one of those who was calling for the return of runaway slaves, and that's because, well, he had a personal stake in that. Remember, George Washington owned a plantation, Mount Vernon, in Virginia, and he had about 300 slaves there. Several of his own slaves ran away and joined the British Army. So, he was trying to recover his own personal property as well as the general property of Southerners, but it didn't work out that way. Which brings us to the very interesting story of Harry Washington. Harry Washington, who was born a free man in West Africa, in the area of West Africa known as Gambia, but who had been captured as a war captive and sold into slavery, and transported across the Atlantic Ocean, where he wound up on Mount Vernon as a slave of George Washington. Initially, I think as a field hand. I think he went on to work with horses, if I remember correctly. But when the war started, Harry, as he was now known, ran away and joined the British Army, a unit called the British Pioneers, and spent the rest of the war fighting against the Continental Army of his former master. When the war was over, he was one of those many Afro-Britons now, I suppose, who were given sanctuary in Canada by the British, and then later still, after being relocated to Nova Scotia in Canada, Britain established a colony in Africa, Sierra Leone, that was meant to be a place to repatriate former slaves. Now, remember that, because Sierra Leone will come into our story again. If that doesn't sound like an African name, Sierra sounds like the Spanish word for mountain, that's because it's not an African word. It is a Portuguese word, actually, the Lion Mountains. Anyway, he was one of 1,000 free blacks who were transported from Canada to the new colony in Sierra Leone. And a bit of a, by the way, notice there, that's the location of Sierra Leone, just south of his homeland of Gambia. And in a bit of an irony, once he was there in Sierra Leone, Harry Washington was one of many discontent people with how the British were running things. And in fact, the British were running things. They weren't allowing the African / Afro-Briton people to make their own decisions. So he became part of a rebellion against the British, which is a bit of an irony, right? Because he had gained his freedom by fighting against the rebellion against the British, but now he is involved in a rebellion against the British, and this one doesn't succeed, and the rebels fail and are defeated, And Harry Washington is actually exiled to a tiny island, which is where he lived out the rest of his life. But all that notwithstanding, that makes for a fascinating story. Someone should write a big sweeping novel or make a movie about Harry Washington. But just thinking about the fact you've got George Washington and Harry Washington from Mount Vernon, and the different paths their lives took them to get to Mount Vernon to begin with, and afterward. Well, meanwhile, back in the U.S., while all this stuff was happening there in Sierra Leone, there were, as I mentioned earlier, during the Revolution, in fact, there were several slaves in Massachusetts who petitioned for their freedom. Remember how I've talked several times about the 13 colonies became 13 states in 1776, and each one of them established their own constitution. The Massachusetts Constitution had an interesting phrase in it. Now, first of all, let me say something about the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson. The Declaration of Independence is not a legal document. It doesn't establish any laws. It was simply declaring that the U.S. was breaking away from Great Britain. All right? So when Thomas Jefferson wrote, all men are created equal, that wasn't a law. However, Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Constitutional Convention, quoted the Declaration of Independence in their state constitution and said in there, all men are created equal, which gave the opportunity for some slaves and their lawyers, their champions, to say, well, it says right here in your new constitution, all men are created equal, so how can my client be a slave? A couple of the first cases that came up in Massachusetts that established precedents for others were the case of Quock Walker, who was a slave, and a slave named Elizabeth Freeman, who is pictured right here. I have a nice quote from her. She said in court, any time while I was a slave, if 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me, and I'd been told I must die at the end of that minute, I would have taken it. Just to stand 1 minute on God's earth a free woman, I would. Well, she got a chance to, because she won her case. It was declared unconstitutional, according to the state constitution, to have slavery in Massachusetts. And that provided a precedent for other northern states then to do the same thing. So, after the new republic had been established, the new government, the new constitution, not the Massachusetts Constitution, but the U.S. Constitution, we'll be talking about that in just a little bit, all that happened so that by 1804, there was no more slavery north of Maryland. Every state had instituted abolition, although it was grandfathered in most of those states, which means they passed the law, and if you own a slave, they're still a slave. It would just be their children who would be free. So if you were the slave, they were kind of out of luck. But at least your kids would be free, so that eventually there would be no slavery at all north of Maryland. Now, of the 13 states, and we're talking about in 1776, not 1800, of the 13 states, 10 of them guaranteed free blacks the right to vote. The 3 who did not surprisingly, Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. But, that means that North Carolina did guarantee free blacks the right to vote, as did Maryland, and as did Delaware. In 1776, there were approximately 10,000 free blacks living in the United States. By 1810, there were almost 200,000. Now, that did not happen as a result of those first 10,000 people. in the course of 34 years having like 40 kids apiece. It's because so many slaves were freed by their owners after the Revolution, particularly in northern states, but also in a lot of southern states. Slave owners freed their slaves because this whole idea of liberty and equality actually meant something to them. Now, the vast majority of slave owners in the South didn't do any such thing. But essentially, by 1800 or so, every major city in the North had a substantial black community, a black neighborhood, free black people living there in the city, living their lives, and guaranteed the right to vote in those northern states. One more thing I want to touch on before we move on is the fact that in this time period we're talking about late 1700s, early 1800s, there were some free blacks, some free people of color, who owned slaves themselves. Now, the reason I want to talk about this is that sometimes people will point to that, people who want to make the argument that slavery wasn't about race at all. And it's usually people who are making defenses for the Confederacy or something like that. And they'll say, see, black people had slaves too. Now, for one thing, most of those free people of color who owned slaves, the biggest number of them were in Louisiana, which had a completely different culture, a Franco-Spanish American culture, and there were a large number of free people of color in Louisiana. But the more important thing to note is the numbers. Now, I can't give it to you directly right here, but I have done the math before, and it works out to something like 0.1% of slave owners was black, which means 99.9% were not. So that makes this an interesting fact, is what it makes it. It doesn't make it anything that could legitimately be used as somehow an argument that slavery and race are not connected. All right, well, that's where the black community was in the United States by circa 1800.